Good morning, everyone, and you're very welcome to today's webinar. For those of you who have just logged on, we have already completed a sound test, and thanks to everyone who helped out with that. So first of all, I want to introduce ourselves. My name is Rachel Hines, and I'm a marketing executive here at Thesaurus Software. And also joined by me today is Karen Bennett, who is the Head of Sales and Marketing at Thesaurus Software, and Laura Murphy, who is our HR Manager and Employment Law Expert. For part one of today's webinar, Karen is going to take you through important COVID-19 payroll updates. For part two, Laura is going to discuss returning to work and the new Return to Work Safely protocol, and I'll be jumping in during both sections with a couple of demos of our software. After we're finished, we'll have a questions and answer session to answer any questions that you may have. And for our questions and answers, we'll be joined by Paul Byrne, who is the Managing Director here at Thesaurus Software, and Audrey Mooney, who is our Customer Support Manager. If you do have any questions, you can type them into the questions box on your control panel at the side of the screen, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. Just to note, we do have a lot of attendees logged on today, so we might not have a chance to answer every single question. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email later today with a link to the recording, so it's no problem if you do need to leave at any stage. Also in the email later today, there will be a copy of the presentation slides that we are using today, or you can also download the slides right now if you wish on the Handouts tab on your control panel. We have a number of useful documents and additional resources that we refer to throughout the webinar. We have a slide at the very end of the presentation with the links to these resources, and we have included the additional resources in the handout section on your screen, but again, these will also be included in the follow-up email. So now that all the housekeeping is out of the way, we may as well get straight into the webinar, and I'm going to pass you over to Karen for part one, important COVID-19 payroll updates.
Thanks, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. So in recent months, Revenue have introduced COVID-19 government schemes to help keep paying employees, with a number of important updates being rolled out. So for part one of today's webinar, we're going to take you through a quick recap of these government schemes. The main one we're going to cover today is the temporary COVID-19 wage subsidy scheme, which has resulted in many updates to the payroll software. The scheme is available for employers who may wish to top up employee payments and for those who are not in a position to do so. The scheme is operating from the 26th of March 2020, and the end date has now been extended until the end of August. The scheme is restricted to employees who are on the employer's payroll as of the 29th of February 2020, and for whom a payroll submission has already been made to Revenue in the period from the 1st of February 2020 to the 15th of March 2020. Where employers didn't fulfill their PAYE reporting obligations for February 2020 by the 15th of March, Revenue will allow such employers access to the scheme, provided the employee in question was included on the employer's payroll on the 29th of February, the February 2020 payroll submission was submitted to Revenue before the 1st of April, and payroll submissions for all previous months were submitted to Revenue before the 15th of March. Now, we're not going to go into detail of the various rates of the subsidy scheme during today's webinar, but if you do want to find out more, you can watch back on our previous webinars, which do go into a lot more detail on this. Subsidy payments are liable to income tax and USC. However, the subsidy is not taxable in real time through the PAYE system during the period of the subsidy scheme. Instead, the employee will be liable for the tax on the subsidy amount paid to them by their employer by way of a review at the end of the year by Revenue. The temporary wage subsidy scheme has been divided into two different phases: the transitional phase and the operational phase. During the transitional phase, employers received €410 subsidy per week for each employee that they made a PRSI class J9 submission for. And this is regardless of the amount of the subsidy actually being paid to the employee. In many cases, this amount exceeded the subsidy that the employee was entitled to receive for that week. And in these cases, the employer is obliged to hold the excess of the subsidy payment received over the amount of the subsidy actually being paid to the employee. And then at a future date, Revenue will perform a reconciliation of employer refunds made to the employer from the 26th of March up to the 4th of May. Where necessary, Revenue will adjust the amount of future refunds that it will make to the employer to take into account the difference between the subsidy the employee was eligible for and the €410 that Revenue refunded to the employer during the transitional phase. So we entered into the operational phase on the 4th of May, and for this phase, Revenue have calculated employees' previous average net weekly pay and their maximum personal subsidy amount, and they have provided this information to employers. Revenue will subsequently refund the applicable wage subsidy, having regard to the maximum wage subsidy and the level of gross pay reported by the employer for each eligible employee. As Revenue have informed employers of which employees are eligible, along with how much they can pay tax-free and the maximum top-up allowed, there is no option to deviate from the amount that Revenue has given you. An employee's average weekly net pay is based on January and February payroll submissions made to Revenue for an eligible employee. Bonuses, commissions, and other payments will be taken into account in the calculation if these were included as part of your gross pay in January and February 2020 payroll submissions. The Revenue instruction is known as a TWSS file, which is in a CSV format. This file must be manually downloaded from ROS and then imported into your payroll software before processing any subsidy payments that fall under the operational phase. In most cases, this will be a one-time download. The exception is where you are rehiring employees after the 1st of May. We're going to have a look at that in a few minutes. So once you've downloaded the TWSS file and then imported it into your payroll software, employers must submit a payroll submission to Revenue on or before the day they pay their employees. And based on this submission, Revenue will then refund the employer the subsidy amount that each applicable employee is eligible to receive after any tapering required has been applied. The refund from Revenue will in general be made to the employer within 2 working days after the receipt of the payroll submission. Now, if an employer no longer wishes to avail of the scheme, or if the employer's circumstances change and the employer no longer meets the employer eligibility criteria, then the employer should stop making any further J9 payroll submissions to Revenue. The employer must also ensure that the PRSI class for all its employees is returned to the correct PRSI class. During the Revenue scheme reconciliation, further guidance will be provided so the employer can reconcile payments made and refunds received and address any outstanding subsidy refunds or repayments necessary. And finally, just to cover a couple of recent changes to the scheme. And first, it's regarding employee eligibility. Employees that were on maternity, adoptive, paternity, or parental leave, or directly related unpaid leave, in receipt of health and safety benefit, parents' benefit, or illness benefit, are now eligible for the scheme. An eligible employer that wants to include any of these employees will need to complete a simple form for each relevant employee, and this form can be found on ROS. Revenue will then check the DEASP data to ensure the employee was in receipt of a DEASP payment, such as maternity benefit. Revenue will then determine a calculated revenue net weekly pay for each relevant employee and will provide the information on the TWSS file. This subsidy will then be backdated to the date of recommencement of employment or from the 26th of March 2020, whichever is the latest date. It was also confirmed yesterday that apprentices that were on training in February now qualify for the scheme. This is also done by the employer submitting the form in My Inquiries, which will then prompt an updated TWSS file. Another recent update to the temporary wage subsidy scheme is that Revenue have decided to place all recipients of the wage subsidy scheme and the pandemic unemployment payment on a week one, month one basis. Earlier this week, Revenue issued RPNs to reflect the week one, month one basis, and this applies to all those that are or have been in receipt of the payments. So next we'll have a look at the payroll implications of rehiring employees. Where an employee previously laid off has been rehired, the employee will qualify for the wage subsidy scheme if their DEASP claim is ceased. However, employees must have had a pay date in February and they must have been included in submissions between the 1st of February 2020 and the 30th of March 2020 to qualify. If an employee is laid off and their employment ceased, and the employer now wishes to place this employee back on the payroll to avail of the wage subsidy scheme, the employer can create a new employment for the employee with the same PPS number, but with a different employment ID, and apply the scheme for this employee. And just to note, the payroll software is able to cater for the different employment IDs. The first batch of TWSS files were made available on the 4th of May, and they did not include employees that were rehired after the 1st of May 2020. From the 21st of May, Revenue commenced a daily refresh of the TWSS files to now include the employee values for those rehired employees. To be included in the updated TWSS file, employers must ensure that the rehired employees are on the payroll and an RPN has been received the day before the employer calculates and submits the first payroll payment for the rehired employees through to Revenue. Employers will receive a notification when an updated employer CSV file is available for download, including when an employee's information has changed due to a rehire in another employment. Where relevant, this Revenue instruction file must be downloaded from ROS again and then re-imported into the payroll software. For pay frequencies other than weekly, employers should consider placing those rehired employees on a weekly pay frequency to simplify the alignment with the TWSS payments and to prevent pandemic unemployment payments overlaps that may trigger a DEASP overpayment situation for the employee. So I'm just going to pass you over to Rachel.
Thanks, Karen. So I want to show you the process in Thesaurus Payroll Manager of rehiring staff who were laid off as a result of COVID-19 and processing the wage subsidy payment for these employees. So when rehiring an employee who was made a leaver in the 2020 tax year, you can simply use the leaver rejoining option. A list of former employees in the tax year will appear, and I just need to double click on the employee's name to add them back onto the payroll. A window will appear detailing the possible subsidy entitlement for the employee, and these figures that have been calculated by the software can be used in the event that the rehired employee wasn't registered in time to get an updated TWSS file before processing the payroll. You can claim subsidy for this employee or do not claim subsidy for this employee as per your requirements. In this example, I'm going to claim the subsidy. Okay. If I go into the Revenue Details tab, you'll see that the employee's PRSI class has automatically changed to J9, which triggers the subsidy payments being applied. And their subsidy payment, as instructed by Revenue, has automatically been entered as an addition. And the gross pay has defaulted to 1 cent. And this 1 cent acts as a notional gross pay amount in order to generate a payroll submission. I'll update the file to save the changes. Once you've added an employee back onto the payroll, you need to request an RPN for this employee. As well as retrieving the employee's tax credits and cutoff points, this will also inform Revenue that the employee has been rehired. Revenue will therefore note to issue an amended TWSS instruction, and this updated file needs to be downloaded from ROS again and re-imported into the payroll software. And to import the TWSS file, go to Utilities, followed by Import Revenue TWSS file. The Thesaurus Payroll Manager will now automatically search your PC for the most recently downloaded TWSS file. If the software is unable to locate your TWSS file automatically, you can instead click on Locate File at the top of your screen and manually browse to where you have it saved. The information contained in the Revenue TWSS file will be displayed on screen. Read the guidance panel here first to understand how the information displayed will be applied in your payroll, and when ready, click Update. The software will now update the tax-free subsidy for all your employees that are on a J9 PRSI class with the applicable values that have been included in the Revenue TWSS file. When you have imported the TWSS file, it will not change any of the gross pay amounts that you've already entered for each employee, and so it's important now to review and amend any gross pay amounts, paying particular attention to where tapering of the subsidy may have been applied. For assistance with this, click on Show Possible Subsidy and Maximum Top-up Available for this employee. An information screen will appear here, and you have the option to apply the maximum top-up or apply minimum top-up. And now the maximum top-up gross that you can pay the employee without affecting the subsidy will flow through to the gross pay field. I'm going to look at Bright Pay now, and I'm not going to cover this in too much detail, as a lot of the details are very similar to the Thesaurus Payroll Manager. To import a TWSS file, go to File, Import Export Data, followed by Import Temporary COVID-19 Wage Subsidy Scheme CSV file. Once you've imported the file, where an employee is on a J9 PRSI class, their subsidy payment as instructed by Revenue will automatically be entered under their additions and deductions. As with Thesaurus, importing the file will not change any gross pay amounts that you have already entered for each employee, and so it's important to keep an eye on the gross pay amounts. If you wish to top up your employee's subsidy payment, click on the subsidy amount box, and BrightPay will assist you in calculating the maximum top-up amount of gross pay that you can pay your employee without affecting the subsidy payment. Simply click on Set to Max to determine this maximum amount. If at any stage you want to remove an employee from the subsidy scheme, simply click on Remove Subsidy, and by doing so, BrightPay will remove the employee from a J9 PRSI class. And finally, just to reiterate again, when it comes to rehiring an employee, an RPN would need to have been requested the day before the employer calculates the first payroll payment for the rehired employee, so that Revenue will know to refresh the TWSS file. And I'll pass you back to Karen again.
Thanks, Rachel. So next is the COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment. And this is available for employees and the self-employed who have lost their job on or after the 13th of March due to the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic unemployment payment was due to end on the 8th of June, but this has now been extended until the end of August. From the 29th of June, this will become a two-tier payment. Those who are earning €200 per week or higher prior to being laid off will remain on the rate of €350 a week. And the payment for those who are earning less than €200 per week will receive €203 per week from the 29th of June. And this is the same rate of payment as the job seekers allowance. If an employee is currently receiving the pandemic unemployment payment and they are now returning to work, being paid via the wage subsidy scheme, they must stop their payment on the first day back at work. So next up, we're going to take a look at managing annual leave during COVID-19. So employees on layoff will continue to accrue public holidays that occur during the first 13 weeks, but they will not accrue annual leave during the period of layoff. Employees working short time will continue to accrue leave for the hours that they work. The annual leave that employees accrue up until the point of being laid off will remain intact, and employers should not pay employees in lieu of this annual leave. Instead, it should be made available to the employee to take once they return to work. Now, given the exceptional circumstances that we are now living in, it could well be the case that an employee genuinely cannot take their accrued annual leave this year. If this situation arises, employers really should try to be flexible in terms of allowing an employee to carry over leave into the next calendar year. So that's the end of part one of today's webinar, and I'm now going to pass you over to Laura for part two. So thanks, Laura.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. Hello, everybody. So I suppose just to look at things from an employment point of view for a moment, and as our customers are looking to bring their staff back, and we've had a few questions on the return to work safety protocol, and I want to go into detail on the protocol now in a moment, and we do get some questions also then on some of the practicalities of bringing staff back to work. So first off, I just would like to give you a flavour of some of those questions, and actually just looking at the questions that are coming in now, some of these questions are reflected in your questions today as well. So firstly, a staff member is refusing to come back to work. What do I do? And the first thing that I would ask here is, well, what are the individual's reasons for not wanting to come back to work? Is it perhaps that they have some health and safety concerns? A lot of people, we've been at home for a long time, and there is that understandable level of anxiety among some people about going back to work. So if this is a reason, then you need to show to the employee what you've done to meet the requirements of the protocol. You need to put their mind at ease and to show them that you have taken preventative measures in your workplace and you've created a safe workplace, because obviously as an employer you do have that duty to ensure your employees' safety, health and welfare at work. So it's important that you can show the employee that and you can put their minds at ease. Perhaps they have childcare issues, and if this is the case, I would just say to be as flexible as you can. It's obviously not your fault that they have childcare issues, but equally, given the current situation, it's not the employee's fault either. So just to be as flexible here, but hopefully I think come the end of July, most childcare facilities will be reopened. So, you know, it may just be a short-term flexibility that's required. Perhaps they're afraid to travel on public transport, and again here it's all about being as flexible and as open to different suggestions, whether it's staggering work hours. I think if you were to take the ultimate decision and dismiss somebody because they didn't want to take public transport, I think the WRC may not look too kindly on that. So it's about really finding a common ground and making compromises where you can. I suppose some of the other questions that we get, do I need to reissue contracts of employment for staff when they return from layoff? So no, it is not necessary. Your employees' contracts of employment is not broken when they are placed on layoff, so their service remains. So assuming that they are returning to work on the same terms and conditions as when they left, then it won't be necessary to reissue contracts. Can I take an employee back on reduced or different hours? And we're seeing this question come in a bit, and absolutely due to social distancing necessities, I think this is becoming more and more common, and it is becoming a common practice. So it is permissible once the employee agrees, because effectively it is a change to the terms and conditions of employment. So certainly I would advise that you get agreement from the employee before they return on the different hours. And then, can I return some employees from layoff and not others? Yes, you can, and there's no set guide as to how you choose who is coming back before others, but what the main area you need to be concerned of is just to be cognizant of the Equality Acts and to use reasonable selection methods and to avoid any discrimination. So there's just a few of the common questions that we get coming in, and as I said, I think we've seen some of those similar questions in the Q&A today. But I'm going to move on now to discuss the Return to Work Safely Protocol, or the protocol I'll call it today. This was published on the 9th of May by the government, and it sets out the key measures that workplaces must be taking to help prevent the spread of COVID in our workplaces. Now, at 29 pages long, it is quite a comprehensive document. There's a lot of information to take in with it. So I want to try and break down some of the key points for you this morning. But just before I go on, just to say that the Health Service Authority, the HSA, they have responsibility for ensuring that employers are following the protocol and putting in the necessary systems. And I have to say that the HSA have really taken the route of being supportive to employers here, definitely not punitive. And they have fantastic guidance on their website, and they have a range of different checklists, and I'd highly recommend that you go on, have a little look at the HSA and look at the checklists there. But what is in the protocol? I see that there are 7. I pulled out 7 key considerations, and I want to go through each one of these now in turn. So firstly, each workplace must appoint at least one lead worker representative who, along with your management team, will have responsibility for ensuring that COVID-19 measures are adhered to in your workplace. And if we go back to the protocol, it very much promotes this collaboration between employer and employees and making sure everybody's working together and on the same page. So that having your lead worker representative is very much the key step in that. And just before I move off this point, and we're talking about transparency and openness and collaboration, it's very much recommended as well that you create a log of everybody in your workplace that has COVID-19 responsibilities. So that might be who's responsible for cleaning the kitchen after lunch, who's responsible for dealing with suspected cases of COVID. And you just have that template log available so everybody knows what's what really. And I know we have a template log that we're sending out after the webinar that might help you as well. So secondly, you'll need to complete a short risk assessment, looking at how and where the virus could be transmitted in your workplace. And from there, you'll learn what control measures that you need to take. Just to note briefly, if there is a change in how any of your work is being carried out, how any of have the tasks changed in any way, then you will need to review your health and safety policies. To move on then to the next mandatory point, which all workplaces need to do, it's to develop a COVID-19 response plan. So this is important, and this is best thought of as a comprehensive catch-all document that deals with all points of relevance relating to COVID-19 and your workplace. So it's very specific to your company. The protocol published by the government specifically sets out the information that you need to include in your response plan. So to give you an idea of what that is, you must be stating how you are going to deal with a suspected case of COVID-19 in your workplace. So you should have an employee appointed who has responsibility for dealing with cases. You also must have a designated isolation area to accommodate somebody who may have contracted the virus. And the idea being that you have a sterile environment where they can go before they can go home if they can't go home immediately. Secondly, you'll need to reference cleaning and hygiene, state how frequently your common areas and your frequently touched surfaces are going to be cleaned. Have you provided sufficient hand washing and hand sanitization facilities? And you need to be putting that in your protocol. You need to reference measures that you've taken to ensure physical distancing. You need to commit to keeping staff informed. It's an obligation on employers that you keep your staff informed, not only on what you are doing in the workplace, but also on public health advice. So things like, the HSE has a video on how to wash your hands properly, and signage, etc. So you need to commit to that in your response plan. Employees have a responsibility too. They have a responsibility to keep up to date, to be sure they're aware of and have informed themselves with the information you're providing them. So it's important that you reference this in your response plan as well. And then finally, mental health. Mental health has been specifically referenced in the protocol, so it's important for you to reference it and to mention how you can support your employees in this regard as well. Okay, just before I finish off that point, just to say, for those of you who are using our Bright Contracts package, we've updated the software with a template COVID-19 response plan. It covers everything that I've just referenced there now and more. We wrote it closely following the HSE guidelines and the checklist from the HSA. So I'd certainly advise, if you were going to use it, that you do review it to make sure it meets your workplace, and you can adjust it and amend it and edit it to put in what's specific to your company and your workplace. But I'd say it's a fantastic blueprint to make sure you're addressing all the points that you need to address, because, as I said, there is a lot in the protocol. Okay. So just to move on to the fourth point, is to complete a pre-return to work form must be completed by all employees, and this must be done at least 3 days before their return to work. So effectively, the form allows employees to self-certify that they do not have COVID-19 symptoms and that they've not been in close contact with any confirmed or suspected cases over the last 14 days. Again, this form, there's a template form on the HSA website. I think we're sending it out as well today. Don't try and create your own one, just use the HSA form and it's perfect. It's a short form, it's a one-page form. It's not a complicated form at all. But just also in talking about employees and returning to work, in communicating with your employees before they return to work, I also recommend that it be advisable to establish whether or not any of your employees might be considered vulnerable workers, because if we have a vulnerable worker who is at a higher risk if they were to contract COVID-19, well, then you need to be sure that you're making the appropriate reasonable adjustments for that employee. So you may need to go a step above and beyond what you're doing for non-vulnerable workers, let's say. And again, the HSE webpage, there is a webpage that sets out who is a high-risk group or who might be a vulnerable person. So you might want to send a link to this page to your employees in advance, just to establish whether or not they might fall into that group. Okay, moving on then. So once your staff have come back to work, they're back on the premises now, you need to give them COVID-19 induction training. So this will include updates on public health guidance. It will go through all the preventative measures that you have in your workplace, what's different for employees now, what do they need to do if they have suspected symptoms. It will clarify all that information and clarify who, again, going back to our responsibilities, who has responsibilities for what. What I would say is that it doesn't have to be an overly complicated training, and you should, you'd certainly be able to consider giving this yourself if you have a well put together COVID-19 response plan. This could certainly double up as your training material. An hour session with your key specific information specific to your company should meet your obligations here. But what I would say is, in terms of providing your induction training, is to be sure to keep a record that the training has taken place and a note of who has attended. Very briefly then, you just need to keep a log of any groups who are working closely together, in close contact together, and the purposes of this being to facilitate and help with any contact tracing that should be required or may be required. And then the final point before I finish up, when you've done all of the above, you may want to look at reviewing and updating some of your existing policies. For example, your sick leave policy, that should really be updated to reflect COVID-19, and you may want to consider updating your working from home policy if you still have employees working from home. And again, the Bright Contract software, we've updated those policies there for you as well. So that brings my section to a close, and I'll pass you back over to Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So I just want to show you how you can use BrightPay Connect to distribute documents to your employees. And this is extremely important at the moment, as there's a lot of information and documents and forms and different letters that you need to give to your employees in relation to COVID-19. You'll see here I have some resources already added, and I have a company handbook, a privacy policy, contracts of employment. And if I scroll down a bit further down the screen, you can see I have a new section added here for COVID-19. I've a document that I distributed to my imaginary employees on tips for working from home. And after a couple of weeks, I sent a company update to touch base with all of my employees. Now that a lot of my employees are returning to work, I've another section added here, COVID-19 return to work. And as per the government's return to work safely protocol, it specifies that information and guidance should be provided by employers to workers, and this should include the signs and symptoms of COVID-19, how it spreads, how to wash your hands, etc. We have included the links to these resources at the end of the webinar, and again, it will be on the follow-up email as well. Scrolling down a bit further again, I had to temporarily lay off some of my imaginary employees. So you'll see here that I have a letter that I distributed to my employees with notice of being placed on layoff. And now that I'm reopening, I can re-engage these employees again. And so I've sent them a return from layoff letter, specifying the date that they can resume working for the company, or if I need to amend their contractual hours upon return to work. And just to note, we have created these template letters for placing an employee on layoff and returning to work. And again, these letter templates are included in the additional resources. Going back to the top of my screen again, you'll see here that we do have a lot of documents, but there is a search bar here where you can easily find whatever document or resource that you're working for. To add a document or resource, you can simply click on Add. And along the side of the screen here, you can see where we have attached a document, or scrolling down a bit, where in this case there is a website link attached. As an employer or manager, you can click in here at any time, and you'll see we have added some notes here, and I've attached a document. And as Laura mentioned, a pre-return to work form must be completed by employees at least 3 days before their return to work. And so I have set the priority on this particular document to high. Further down the screen, we can make the resource visible to employees. We can pre-schedule it to be available from a certain date, and we can show it in the notifications on the employee dashboard. We can also specify which employees we want to access the document. Documents and resources can be distributed to all employees, to a particular department, or even to an individual employee. In this instance, all my employees need to complete the return to work form, so I'm going to leave this at all employees. Back to the top of the screen, I have a couple of additional tabs here. I can send notifications to employees so that they get an email notification, or if they're using the employee app, they'll also get an instant notification on their smartphone or tablet. And finally, then there's an activity log to view who has accessed the document and when. And this is really beneficial as it protects you as an employer, as you have evidence that a particular employee has read the important document. The final thing I want to show you then is the employee app, which is available with both BrightPay Connect and the Source Connect. So when you send that notification to employees, they'll instantly receive a notification on their smartphone device. You'll see here that they have a notification for a return to work form. And when we open the app, you'll see in the new option under the notifications here for a return to work form. And the employee can click on this at any time to access the document and fill out the form and email it back to their employer, or if we added any external website or any messaging, they would appear here for the employee to access also. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and there's a number of additional links and resources here that you can refer back to for more information. We have covered a lot on today's webinar, but we will send everyone an email later today, and this will include a copy of the slides, all of the additional resources on the screen here, as well as a link to the recording of today's webinar. So it's now time for the questions and answers, and if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box, and we will try to get through as many questions as possible. As I mentioned at the start of today's webinar, we do have a lot of attendees logged on watching today's webinar, so unfortunately we won't have a chance to answer every single question, and I do see a lot of questions have come in already today. So I'm going to read out the questions, and joining us to answer those questions, we have Paul Byrne, who is the Managing Director here at Thesaurus Software, and Audrey Mooney, who is our Customer Support Manager. So Audrey, I think I might come to you first and just ask about what are the hot topics that are coming in on the support line at the moment?
Thanks, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. I suppose, our hot topics or frequently asked questions are constantly changing, I suppose, in line with the scheme changing and being updated. So I suppose the current ones, and I suppose the top one probably hasn't changed since it started, but it's just, I suppose, querying the values in the TWSS file issued by revenue. And many employers, for one reason or another, I suppose, wishing to pay more than the maximum allowed, maybe due to hours worked, commission due, etc. But this isn't permitted, and will only reduce the subsidy received by revenue. We were getting quite a few queries in relation to apprentices that were on training in February, but as Karen mentioned, since yesterday they are now catered for. And employers just need to complete that form of My Inquiries to get the updated TWSS file. I suppose we get some inquiries just on, I suppose, how to come off the scheme, which is a good thing, I suppose, if employers feel they don't need it anymore. And rehires would still be quite topical. And it's just, I suppose, just helping customers and assuring them that the TWSS file will be updated to include those rehires. So that's most of them, Rachel. Thank you.
Brilliant. So I might get started on the questions here. So the first question here is there any issue with not having all employees within a company claiming the COVID-19 subsidy? Are you aware of revenue having an opinion on this? And this might happen in the case where an employee is applying for a mortgage and the lender requests recent payslips that do not show COVID-19 subsidy on them.
Hi, Rachel, I'll take that one. Good morning, everyone. No, there are no issues with that whatsoever. And Audrey, you can pipe in here if I'm getting any of this wrong. No, it's up to the employer to claim the J9 subsidy in relation to the employees, providing they qualify. So no, there's no issues there.
Great. The next question. Even though a company claiming the COVID subsidy has reopened, is there any guidance on going off or staying on the subsidy? Does the 25% reduction in Q2 2020 income still remain the golden rule?
I'll take that one again, Rachel. No, the 25% reduction Q2 versus Q1 is still the golden rule. You can also compare it with Q2 the previous year, if you want. We were interested to see that revenue didn't actually make any changes in relation to expected business for Q3, as you would imagine, since they extended the scheme to the end of August. It's still based on Q2 versus Q1. There is extensive guidance on Revenue's website in relation to the necessary proofs and eligibility criteria, and that hasn't changed. So, as I say, the overriding rule is still in relation to reduction in turnover or orders in Q2. Thank you.
Great. The next question here regarding the wage subsidy scheme. We've been consistently overpaid by revenue for the wage subsidy scheme by €500 per week, approximately since the 2nd of May. Is this the norm, and when will revenue review these payments?
Actually, I would have thought that since the 2nd of May, since the start of the operational phase, there really shouldn't be any overpayments. Now, unless you're actually including the refunds of tax and USC in what you consider to be overpaid. Audrey, you wouldn't have any thoughts on this, would you?
No, I would think unless it's refunds or if somebody's paying less than the subsidy, stated on the file from revenue, which they don't actually allow you to do. I suppose you have to remember that revenue don't see the subsidy you're paying to the employees, so they're going by the values that they provided to you. So that's all I can think of, either refunds or they're paying less than the subsidy, given by revenue.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be correct to pay less than the subsidy.
No.
The whole idea of the operational phase was to basically cut out the idea that the revenue would be overpaying, because during the transitional phase they were paying a flat 410 per week, even though the subsidy might have been a lot lower, in which case there would have been extensive overpayments in that case. But it shouldn't be happening in the operational phase.
Okay.
Sorry, just one of the part at the end of that question was when will revenue review these payments, and that's part of the reconciliation phase that they're going to start over. Well, it'll start in the next couple of months. We don't quite know when yet. They've issued us a file spec for a CSV file, which employers would need to upload on the Revenue Online service, and this will contain details of all the subsidies paid to each of the employees in the various pay periods. And we more or less have that finished at this stage, but as far as we're aware, Revenue won't be in a position to accept the file until sometime in August. But when they get that file, they would then reconcile what you have paid out in subsidy versus what they've refunded you, and there will be a reconciliation in terms of looking for the overpayment back at that stage.
Great. Next question here. An employee is on the temporary wage subsidy scheme and getting topped up to normal net pay, but not actually working as the shop is closed. Are they entitled to accrue annual leave?
All right, I can come in here. So no, they're not. You'll only accrue annual leave for the hours that you have worked. So if you're not working, you're not accruing annual leave.
Okay. If you don't have full-time work as before for employees or reduced hours and they don't take them, what are the options? Also, when offering hours for returning staff, is there a protocol, for example, full-time staff first?
Okay, I'll take the first section first. This question has come in and I've seen it a few times so far, and it's a tricky one. Obviously, if you're changing, by offering different hours, you're changing an employee's terms and conditions, so you should be getting agreement. And failing that, it's really about communication with the employee and trying to understand why is it that they don't want to come back. It could be some of the reasons that we talked about earlier, health and safety concerns. Perhaps it's because they feel maybe on the pup that they're bringing home more money. In that situation, I'd be going back to my contract of employment, and that's your basis in all your dialogue with your employees. It's the contract, the employee, you're obliged to pay the employee and obliged to provide them with work. And if you have work available for them, they should be coming in. So I'd go through all my communications with the employee. I'd try and get agreement. I'd work through the reasons possibly why. Failing all of that, yes, there is an argument to say, well, I don't have full-time work, so your position is redundant, and there is a possibility to make a redundancy there. I'm going to add in another proviso there, because when making anybody redundant, one of the things we have to look at is to make sure there was no alternative to a redundancy. And the fact that an alternative to redundancy at the moment may be the wage subsidy, that the employee could have been remained on, that could be a counter argument, and we don't know for sure. We'd have to see cases coming through the WRC, but certainly it's just about trying to communicate to the employees, and hopefully employees can be on the same page about getting the business back up and running. And sorry, Rachel, the second part of that, when offering hours for returning staff, is there a protocol, full-time staff first? No, going back to what I mentioned earlier, and just being cognizant of the Equality Act. So, whatever, make a decision based on your business needs and what your business, how your business is going to reopen, and just to be sure that you're not discriminating anybody in choosing anybody.
Great. Next question here, Laura, I think is for you again, and it's a bit of a long one. My employees have been laid off and receiving the pandemic unemployment payment. They will not be returning to work and have requested their outstanding holiday pay. Will making this payment to them affect their entitlement for the unemployment payment? Can I avail of the subsidy scheme to make these payments? And if I can't afford to pay the holiday pay now, can I postpone the payment until my business is operating fully again?
Okay, so essentially here, somebody has been laid off and now you are moving, you're not returning them, so you're going to be making them redundant. And then in a redundancy process, there's obviously, there's steps to follow, and there's an entitlement that the employees are entitled to. And one of that is being the holiday pay that they've accrued before they were laid off. So they should receive that payment. And it shouldn't affect any unemployment payment that's owed to them. There's an argument, we were only talking yesterday about whether any notice payments or redundancy payments could be claimed through the scheme. I think the argument is they really shouldn't be, because the purpose of the scheme is to help keep employees in work, and if you're moving away from that, then it shouldn't apply. How that could be applied in practice, or how it could be policed, I don't know. So I suppose it's up to you as an employer to decide when are you going to formally make these people redundant, and you might decide, well, it doesn't suit me to make them redundant now, and I'll leave them on layoff for the period of the scheme is available, and then once you decide to make them redundant, that's when you go through the process, and that's when you make those outstanding payments that the employees are due.
Great. The next question here. What if you didn't see someone on the payroll while they were in receipt of the pandemic unemployment payment?
I can take that one, Rachel. I suppose this was a real hot topic at the beginning of the scheme. The initial guidance from Revenue had said that employees should be ceased on the payroll in order to claim the pandemic unemployment payment from DASP. But it did transpire then after a little while that actually DASP didn't require the cessation date. So we do have quite a mix where some employers ceased and some didn't. And there's no issue if you didn't, provided you've left them on a zero payment, and just, I suppose, make sure that when they do come back, if you're including them on the wage subsidy scheme, not to submit a J9, submission for them until you're actually availing of the scheme, because, if you send in a J9 when they're on the PUP payment, it'll be seen as a duplicate claim.
Great. I didn't lay staff off if I just returned a nil payment every week while they received the pandemic unemployment payment. Do I just put in payments as normal when they resume?
I can take that one, Rachel. It's kind of a follow-on. So absolutely, if you left them on the payroll with, zero payment or a nil payment, when they do come back, then just re-enter their payments and just, again, make sure the PRSI class is what it should be.
Great. When an employee is rehired and, for example, their subsidy is €90 per week, if they only worked 5 hours that week and were only entitled to 50/50, does the employer reduce the subsidy to 50/50 and pay them 1 cent, or are they paid the subsidy amount?
Okay, I can take that one as well, Rachel. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about a couple of moments ago. So you can't pay less than the subsidy value as issued by Revenue. So even if they didn't work the hours, I suppose, it doesn't matter. They have to get the full subsidy. You're not permitted to pay any less. So the full subsidy in that case.
Great. Paul, we might come back to you again. Is there any information as yet on how Revenue plan on recouping the tax owed on the COVID payment? I asked because I noticed that all our employees went on a week 1 basis this week.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we were probably advocating from the beginning of this scheme, that, it probably would have been better for employees to be on a week 1 basis at that stage. But Revenue's attitude was that employees should probably get as much money as they can into their hands, given the circumstances. So at this stage now they have changed to week 1 basis, but there will still be tax and USC owing on those payments at the end of the year for the employees. And revenue have indicated that it will more than likely spread it over a couple of years by basically reducing what I would call a tax credit certificate for those years. So it'll be spread out. And obviously, if there's something like a medical expenses claim or whatever, it would be netted off against that.
Great. I have an employee coming back to work this month from maternity. The CSV file I got from Revenue only allows the company to pay €520 top up, but I need that to be bigger. What can I do in this case?
Actually, Audrey, you can help me out on this one. I don't think there's really any option here. You know, if you need to pay them more than the subsidy and top up, it's going to be tapered, which will end up reducing the net pay anyway, because you're basically increasing a gross amount and reducing a tax-free amount. So I think in that case, they're probably going to end up being back on an A class. Would that be your reading of that, Audrey?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, would it be somebody that perhaps was getting a small payment by the employer when they were in receipt of maternity benefit? And in that case, Revenue would be basing their earnings and subsidy values on the payment that went through. So, I mean, they're kind of catered for those employees returning from maternity. So, I mean, if they feel the figures are wrong, then, you know, raise the query through my inquiries. You know, and if Revenue agree, I suppose they'll issue an adjusted TWSS file, but otherwise, no, unfortunately, there isn't a way.
Okay. We are on the payment subsidy scheme and notice that this week a lot of the net payments have reduced. Why is this?
I'll take that one. That's quite an easy one. That's because basically everybody's been put on a week one basis from this week, and they're no longer getting any tax refunds.
Okay. Laura, if an employee is on the COVID payment from social welfare, but the employer now wants to cease their employment, can the employer pay any outstanding holiday pay due to the employee?
Yeah, a similar one, Rachel. We've already had, and absolutely on terminating employment, you need to pay any outstanding accrued annual leave. The only time that this is the only time when this can be done, we usually say that holiday pay shouldn't be paid in lieu, but it must be paid on termination of employment. So yes.
Okay. I'm running a payroll for an employer for week 26, which is the first run since week 13. Do I have to run nil payrolls for weeks 14 to 25?
Okay, I'll take that one, Rachel. I suppose if you've left the employees on the payroll, you will have to update all those weeks in between, and there is an option to mark the PSR as sent as opposed to sending it to Revenue. But I suppose if you didn't have employees on the payroll, you should be getting a message when you're opening up the software to tell you how I suppose you can skip the payroll forward. So this would mean just going to update payslips before you add in those employees again. But if you want to get in touch with support, obviously we can help with that.
Perfect. If I got an employee who is taking a reduction in hours due to lack of childcare, do I adjust the ER top up for the change as I can't amend the revenue figures?
Yeah, absolutely. The employer payment can be adjusted. You know, you've got options there. You can pay nothing, or you can pay the full maximum employer payment that you can pay on the TWSS file, or it can be something in between. So yeah, that can be adjustable. The subsidy value can't.
Okay. We have decided to claim the temporary subsidy from this week only for all employees. Will the TWSS download allow this?
Yeah, I suppose there's a TWSS file there for all employers, whether they registered for the scheme or not, you know, whether they've availed of the scheme or not. So that file will be there and it will include all employees. So if you want to use it now, I suppose you can just import the file and just put the employees onto the PRSI class J9, and the information then will be on the system for them.
Have Revenue made any changes yet regarding rehiring employees mid-month to enable them to return on the monthly payroll as opposed to weekly?
I think I'll get your help on this one, Audrey. I know their latest FAQs mentions that particular subject as well. But I suppose the ideal is if you could put them back on weekly, or sorry, change them to weekly when they come back on mid-month. It would mean that everything kind of ties up with the subsidy and the refund that's coming from revenue. I think the latest guidance, which has changed, is that if somebody is still going to remain on monthly payroll and they're rehired mid-month, the employer is actually meant to reduce the subsidy and the top-up proportionately in relation to the number of insurable weeks versus over the number of insurable weeks total of that month. And if they do actually end up still paying, sorry, in that case, revenue will still refund the full month, which would mean that they'd be overpaid, and that'll come out of the reconciliation process. If it's a case that the employer still pays the full month subsidy to the employee, even though they've only returned mid-month, the employee will then owe back the PUP to the ESP for the weeks that they've been overpaid. It's a little bit messy, the whole thing. The ideal is that somebody would actually change to weekly when they come back mid-month. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Audrey.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we all agree that we're practical. The best option is to move the employee to a weekly payroll, because you're then avoiding issues with duplicate claims. But yes, the most recent guidance that was issued yesterday, I suppose, is saying, where that's not practical, that you can adjust the subsidy for a number of weeks and just make sure that you report the insurable weeks, for the same value. And yeah, that'll be, I suppose, followed up in the reconciliation process.
Great. I've noticed the time here. We have hit 11:30, which was the end for today's webinar, but there is still a lot of questions outstanding here. So we are going to stay on a bit longer and answer a few. But if you do need to leave or time, feel free to do so. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out the follow-up email where you can watch it back to listen to the questions and answers. The next question here: will the cessation of the scheme be based on submission date or the payroll date? I.e., in a 4-week pay period, 2 weeks might be in August, 2 weeks in September, but the submission will be in September.
Yeah, it's a good question. We really haven't been given any information on the end of the scheme yet. Our gut feeling is that it will be based on the payroll date and the submission date. A combination of the two of them really is, because that's how they basically rolled out the operational phase. But no, we don't have any full details or any proper details on that yet, but we'll keep an eye on the FAQs for that one.
Okay. Does the TWSS taper if a former part-time employee in January and February, their average net pay was €150, is now being re-employed for say 30-35 hours per week? Their new net is 300 to 350. Should the employee be on a J9 or AO?
Yeah, I think in that case the tapering will be so severe that they'll end up with no subsidy. And therefore go back on an A0 rate in that case.
Great. Laura, we might come back to you again. How best to proceed where an employee won't return to work as they're earning more money on the pandemic unemployment payment scheme?
Okay, so I'm going to assume here, Rachel, that they're being offered the same hours as they were before they went off, and we've already dealt with a change of hours. So where you want somebody to come back on the same hours as previously and they're returning, I'm going to go back again to our contract of employment, and with our contract there's a mutuality of obligation there, which means that the employer is obliged to provide work and that the employee in return is obliged to come in and do that work. Maybe not come in, but is obliged to do that work. So where that is happening on the employer's perspective and they're providing the work and the employee is refusing, I would see that as a breach of contract. Obviously, I'm going to put it in again, talk to them and see what the reasons are. Is it something, innocent concerns, health and safety, childcare, travel, all those ones that you may be able to discuss. If it is just for reasons because they're earning more money elsewhere, you know, I would say that is a breach of contract, and you could possibly look towards moving towards a disciplinary in that situation.
Great. Did you say there's no need to reissue contracts as layoff is not broken service? Please, can you clarify on this?
Yes, layoff is temporary. It's not a permanent state or redundancy. Layoff is only temporary, so unless you're changing terms of conditions, changing hours, there's no need to reissue the contract.
Okay. If someone in the workplace is confirmed with COVID-19, has everyone in the workplace to self-isolate?
Yeah, I put this one in because it's not for us to say, and it's not really for the employer to make that decision either. I'd work with the HSE. It's the HSE who are responsible for contact tracing. You might have a log to assist the HSE, but it's not your responsibility. Now, internally, you may decide on what measures you need to take, but I'd follow medical or professional advice before I make that decision.
Okay. Where is the option on revenue to download the TWSS file?
Okay, I can take that one, Rachel. So when you log into Ross and My Services, under Employer Services, you'll see Revenue Payroll Notifications, or the RPNs. So if you click on Request RPNs, you then get the option to download the Temporary Wage Subsidy Scheme calculation. So it's in there, and generally that'll then go into your downloads folder.
Okay. If you're coming off the wage subsidy scheme, when should you change the PRSI class details?
Okay, I can take that one. I suppose you should just make sure that you change it before you run the first payroll where, employees should be off the scheme. So for example, if you've processed week number 26 and that's on the wage subsidy scheme, just make sure that, if you don't want them on the wage subsidy scheme on week 27, just change the PRSI class before you process week 27.
Okay. Next question. Can you top up an employee's subsidy payment by any amount between the maximum and the minimum recommended?
Yes, absolutely. So it can be anything up to the maximum value. Yeah.
Okay. Balances outstanding on PAYE returns April and May, even after paying the liability in full. According to the latest operational guidance, employee tax refunds are paid to employers together with the TWSS, and this is being recovered by revenue on the PAYE return. Is this correct? It is unusual that this hasn't been published, as I'm sure it is causing a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I'll take that one, Rachel. You're right. Basically, the PAYE, the tax liability showing in the payroll, assume that any liability for PAYE or USE or PRSI are being reduced by any refunds made to employees during the same period. But because with the subsidy scheme, revenue are actually including the refunds for USC and tax in the TWSS refunds that they send out to employers, it wouldn't be right to therefore reduce the other liabilities by those amounts when paying the P30s. I know I'm using old phraseology here. So that's why we actually issued an upgrade there recently to the software where employers could actually enter the amounts of tax and USC that were refunded under the TWSS scheme, because this would need to be adjusted in the actual P30 calculations to figure out how much is actually still owing to revenue for the P30s in those cases.
Okay. Is it sufficient for the 25% reduction in turnover to use Q2 of 2020 versus Q2 of 2019? Will Q3 be brought into play for eligibility?
Yeah, this is a very topical subject, obviously, and it's been asked before as well. The guidance does suggest that you can use Q2 of 2019 in your comparative to figure out whether there's been a 25% reduction or not. It also uses, wording such as, ability to pay wages and so forth. But Q3 doesn't seem to come into it whatsoever, and we've asked revenue consistently on that point, because, say, with the scheme being extended to 31st of August, you would imagine that they'd be looking at quarter three in that case. You know, so it looks like you could have a very good quarter three, yet still be qualifying up to the 31st of August, although that would impact on the ability to pay wages and that consideration. What I'll do actually is I'll send out in the chat bar the link to the revenue PDF file. I know I've read it a few times and I still have a lot of questions myself as to, you know, there would be edge cases as to, you know, whether some employers would qualify or not for it or be eligible or not. So it's definitely, I don't know, it's one for your accountant to help you with on this one, but I'll send it anyway, and say you can be just as confused as I am.
Great. The next question here, any tips re communally used equipment, for example, photocopies?
I'll come back in there, Rachel. So yeah, this is your frequently touched surfaces. The protocol states that your workplace should be ideally cleaned twice a day. Doesn't say that you need to have a professional cleaner in to do that. I know there's, you know, we've skeleton staff here in our office, and we have our domestic wipes, and we wipe down our kettle and all those frequently touched surfaces twice a day. So it's just about practicalities like that, really.
Great. Should we be requiring employees to complete the return to work form every 2 weeks, or otherwise certify every 2 weeks that they are symptom free? And should you repeat the return to work when an employee takes annual leave?
Okay, so I'll take the first part there, Rachel, first. There's no requirement that you have to be having this that you need to have the return to work form completed every 2 weeks. It's really only when the person is returning to work after a period of time. But what I would advise is that you clearly set out in your response plan that if an employee's situation changes, or if that they've come into contact with somebody, or if they've traveled, that they do come and speak to the relevant manager and let them know. So you've clear communication in your company, and then that just leads then into the second question. Yes, if somebody's been on annual leave, I would advise that they complete the form.
Great. Can we get a quote for Bright contracts, and can you start this now mid-year?
Yes, you can start at mid-year, Rachel. It's a rolling 12 months as opposed to the payroll, which is with the tax year. And for a standard license, it's 149 plus VAT, and for a bureau, it's 299 plus VAT.
Okay. Another question here regarding the return to work form. If you've been working from home and are returning to work in the office, do you have to fill in a return to work form?
Yes, absolutely, and that's probably most people who will be filling it in. Yes, you will.
Okay. Audrey, we might come back to you again. Can you continue to claim the wage subsidy scheme when we bring our staff back to work until it ends in August?
Yeah, I suppose this all comes back to the eligibility and the ability to pay wages. I suppose if you still feel that, you know, you're eligible and that, you know, the company is unable to pay wages without the subsidy scheme, then yes, you can, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can, I suppose, use it until the scheme ends in August.
Yeah, I go back to an interview I heard with the chairman of the Revenue Commissioners on RT Morning Ireland there a couple of months ago at this stage. And the question I think came up as to, you know, what if somebody had, you know, sufficient funds, but they had those funds planned for other things, like maybe, you know, they need to fit out their pub in such a way that it complies with the new regulations, or they had other plans for expansion or whatever. And as far as I remember, the chairman actually said that that's fine, and you know, they can use those funds for those purposes. So you know, it's kind of very unclear as to what constitutes ability to pay wages in that case. So as I say, like, you know, you can read that document that's sent out in the chat bar. It is quite confusing to know exactly, you know, what the eligibility criteria are fully.
Okay. New employees that were previously working elsewhere on subsidy schemes, should we place them on the subsidy scheme or are on our own payroll?
I can take that one, Rachel. I suppose it's only employees that were employed by the employer on the 29th of February, you know, that would be eligible. So I mean, if the employee was working with somebody else at that time, you know, regardless of whether they were paid the subsidy with that previous employer, you know, they're not eligible for the scheme with a new employer. They have to have been in employment on the 29th of February.
Okay. Is PRSI payable by employee on the wage subsidy at the end of the year?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Rachel. No, it isn't. It's only the tax and the USC.
Okay. On the monthly totals in the Source payroll where it says refunded through TWSS scheme, do I enter the total amount that I received revenue?
Just entered the amounts that were received in relation to tax and USC refunds.
Okay. What if we cannot rehire staff due to lower productivity? Do we have to lay them off permanently?
I'll come back in there, Rachel. Yes, you do have to lay them off permanently. So anybody who's been on layoff on the subsidy or on the PUP, that's a temporary layoff, and you then need to move towards permanently terminating the contract of employment, and that would be through a redundancy. And they may be entitled to redundancy pay depending on their length of service with you.
Okay. Can you pay annual leave and public holidays and avail of the wage subsidy scheme?
Yes, you can. The only thing is there may be a tapering issue if you're paying, because you need to pay annual leave at the full rate or the normal rate of pay. So just need to be aware of that, but you can.
Okay. If an employee was employed in February, but when COVID-19 happened, the employer returned home to Italy. Since then, we have employed someone else. What is our position in the employer return end of June?
Well, I suppose that will really depend on the circumstances when the employee left. Did they resign? Was there a resignation, or was it just I'm going home for the duration of the lockdown? And if it was left and very much in a temporary position, then their contract hasn't been terminated and they still have employment, so they would still be entitled to come back to work. So it would very much depend on how they left.
Great. Can employers make employees take 2 weeks holidays, say in July, in order to use their holidays, even though they do not want to take holidays then and are on the COVID wage subsidy and the company topping up part of their wages?
Yes, so employers have full entitlement to request when employees can take their annual leave. You just need to give sufficient notice. So it's 1 month's notice. Now that can be shortened down with agreement, but at the very minimum, you need to give 1 month's notice. And again, as you said earlier, the employees do need to receive their full payment for annual leave.
Great. We'll finish up shortly now, but I was getting an average of €275 a week part-time before the pandemic hit. Now it seems I'm entitled to an 85% subsidy, add a top up to get €350 a week. Why am I entitled to get €350?
Okay, I can take that one, Rachel. Okay, yeah, I suppose this was just so that I suppose an employer could bring an employee's pay up to €350 to bring it in line with the pandemic unemployment payment, so that wasn't, I suppose, it wasn't preventing people, or I suppose determined for people to come back to employment. But the employer payment is optional, so they don't have to top it up to bring it up to the €350. But it was just, again, just to bring it in line.
Perfect, thanks for that. And the last question we'll take today, a member of staff started in mid-February. Her weekly pay sent to revenue is incorrect. Can this be rectified by revenue in the subsidy payment?
I don't mind taking that one, Rachel. I suppose I wouldn't advise correcting it now, because revenue will look at the latest date for the submission, not the original date. So actually, if you were to correct February now, the employee would no longer be eligible for the scheme. So I suppose it'll make a bad situation worse, if you like. So I don't know how it ended up being incorrect, but it may be best just to wait until the subsidy scheme is over to correct it if it genuinely is incorrect. But it will make the employee ineligible, unfortunately.
Great. So I think we might finish up there. I might come back to Laura again. Is there anything you want to reiterate or clarify before we finish up today?
No, Rachel, I don't think so. We're good.
Audrey and Paul, anything else you want to add?
I suppose really it's just to emphasise that employers can't pay more than the maximum values permitted on the TWSS file. And I suppose the reason for wanting to or needing to pay more doesn't really matter. Unfortunately, it's just not permitted. But if anybody, I suppose, has genuine concerns or they have dispute, they dispute the values, then raise it with revenue via my inquiries. So at least if they agree, they can adjust the TWSS file.
And I guess they shouldn't be paying any less than the actual subsidy amount that applies by revenue either.
Correct, yeah.
Great. So yeah, as I said, we'll finish up there and we will send out a follow-up email within the next couple of hours. And this will include a link to the recording of the webinar, the copy of the presentation slides, and any of the additional resources that we mentioned throughout today's webinar. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's webinar and we hope you found it useful. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.